Well, thank you, and thank you for the very kind introduction. And it really is an honor to be asked to address this group. I get to speak to lots of different groups about lots of different topics, and this is something that's really near and dear to my heart. And what I'm going to talk about is something a little different than probably most of what you've done. I absolutely agree with the Honourable Minister. I think we have tremendous opportunity in front of us. But there's some of those bigger forces going on out there in the world that if we don't just keep them tucked away in the back of our mind, are going to come back and bite us when we least expect it. And that's what I want to talk a bit about this morning. Hey, I'm going to take you on a bit of a global tour here. I'll try to keep it moving along really quickly. You can see this is kind of what we're going to talk about here. I like this quote, and this is really appropriate today. People only accept change when they're faced with necessity, and they only recognize necessity when a crisis is upon them. John Monnet, and this is really apropos for the guy who came up with this quote, he was one of the original founders of the EU, which in my humble opinion was a very flawed experiment, which will probably have many more tough days ahead of it. To have a common currency without an underlying fiscal union, which allowed the weak countries on the southern periphery, Spain, Portugal, Italy, Greece, to be able to borrow at the same rate that the strong countries in the north, such as Germany and Finland, could borrow at, made absolutely no sense. Made no sense then, it makes no sense now, and I think we've just seen part one of a multi-part drama. Anyway, that's not what we're here to talk about. I'm going to start off with just a couple of slides here on something, again, not directly pointed at what we really want to get to, but something that I think might be very valuable to you going forward. And this actually comes out of the world of behavioral finance. And what we know is that we have two parts of the brain. The more primitive part of the brain, the emotional part of the brain, was what, as we see up here, when a saber-toothed tiger is coming out of the bush and trying to eat us for lunch. It is the emotional part of the brain that causes us to either fight or flee. And then we've got the logical part of the brain, which is what we really want to be using as we make decisions. Now, we've got a little test here to find out, do you tend to use your emotional part of your brain? Or are you able to override the emotional part with the more logical part of the brain? There's only 3 questions here. They were developed by Shane Frederick at MIT and Yale. And they have proven to be very good at differentiating those who make decisions on a more emotional basis to those who make decisions on a more logical basis. So, and I hope you don't take offense. So I'm just going to ask you to try it. There's only 3 simple little questions. Grab a pencil, write down your answers, and let's just see what happens. Okay? Nobody needs to know the answers. This is only for you. And so question number 1. A bat and a ball together cost $1.10 in total. The bat costs $1 more than the ball. How much does the ball cost? Okay, think about your answer. We'll come back to the answers in a second, okay? I'll just give you a second to think through that one. Okay? Question number 2. If it takes 5 minutes for 5 machines to make 5 widgets, how long would it take 100 machines to make 100 widgets? Simple little questions. Everybody got their answer to question number 2? Okay, let's go on to question number 3, and then we'll come back and we'll talk about the answers. In a lake, there's a patch of lily pads. Every day the patch doubles in size. If it takes 48 days for the patch to cover the entire lake, how long will it take to cover 1/2 of the lake? A very important concept, especially for all of you people in the public planning arena. Let's go back to question number 1 now and talk about the answer. Who wants to throw up their hand and say, I know what the right answer is? Don't be shy.
10 cents.
How many said 10 cents? Let's see a show of hands. How many said they're all wrong? Good. What else did you get?
5 cents.
Absolutely right. It's 5 cents, isn't it? Of course it's 5 cents. If we the bat costs $1 more than the ball. The ball costs 10 cents. That would mean the bat must cost $1.10, and so the sum of the two would be $1.20. Okay? All right. This is what most people do. I'll show you the actual numbers of people who how you score on this. Let's go on to number 2. If it takes 5 minutes for 5 machines to make 5 widgets, how long does it take for 100 machines to make 100 widgets? Somebody throw out an answer.
5 minutes.
Wonderful! 5 minutes, of course. Everybody get it right? Everybody got it right, didn't you? Okay. Let's go on to the last one. It takes 48 days for the lily pads to cover the lake. How many days for the lily pads to cover 1/2 of the lake? 47 days, you're absolutely right. This is a critical concept that we must never forget when we're looking at all kinds of things. Okay? The concept of the doubling period. Very, very critical. So how do most people do? Among 3,500 test takers, only 17% of them scored 100%. 33% got none right. Of 600 professional money managers, only 40% scored 100%. Among MIT students, arguably some of the brightest in the world, only 48% scored 100%. Give yourselves a pat on the back. You've done really, really well here. Now, if you did get 100%, so what does that tell us? Well, if you did, you're not going to be subject to some of the other biases that we often talk about in behavioral finance, but you are probably subject to over-optimism, overconfidence, and what we would call a confirmatory bias. In other words, you only want to read those things that say, what I already believe to be true is in fact true. See, aren't I smart? Instead of going out and saying, you know what? I believe A to be true, so I better figure out what would tell me that maybe A isn't true. Maybe I'm going down the wrong path here. Okay, perfect. Now, emotional thinking, those of us who make decisions with the emotional side of our brain, when do these things happen? When the problem's ill-structured and complex, when the information is incomplete, ambiguous, and changing, when the goals are ill-defined, shifting, or competing, when stress is high because either time constraints and or high stakes are involved, and when decisions rely upon an interaction with others. Does that sound like your day? It sounds like my day, absolutely. And so we're all kind of pushed toward emotional thinking, but to the extent we can, we have to try to override that with the more logical parts of our brain. Okay, now what I want to do is talk about demographics for a little bit. And we all know what demographics is, things like age, sex, and mortality. I shorten it up to a simple sentence. So who's going to look after grandma? And that's really what it all comes down to. If we take a look at a little graphical picture of what's going on, back in 1950, we were over here. We were this slender, no fat, lots of young people, just a few older people here at the very top of the pyramid. And what's happened since 1950? We get up here to the year 2000, and we got a bit of a middle-age spread starting to happen. The pyramid is starting to widen out. It's kind of like I am as I'm getting older. My midsection is getting wider here. And by the year 2050, we're going to be the third pyramid over here. We got a huge middle-age spread now. The bottom of the pyramid is smaller, and the top is looking more like this. This is what we want to talk about. We want to talk about the implications of what's going on. The world is turning gray. And you'll be probably quite surprised at how quickly and how pervasive the world is turning gray. Population aging is unprecedented, is without parallel in human history, And the 21st century will witness even more rapid aging than did the century just past. Population aging is pervasive. It's a global phenomenon affecting every man, woman, and child. But countries are at very different stages of the process. And the pace of change differs greatly. Countries that started the process later will have less time to adjust. And finally, population aging is enduring. We are not going to return to the young populations that our ancestors knew. And population aging has profound implications for almost all facets of human life. So, with that as a backdrop, so what is the problem? Number one, of course, population growth rates all over the world are slowing rapidly. First of all, thank heavens. If the world kept on growing at the pace that it was, in just 780 years, do you know how much land space there would be for each man, woman, and child living on the earth at that point? Just 780 years in the future. Would you believe about 1 square meter? Here's my neighbor A here, and my neighbor B, and my neighbor C, and my neighbor D, and I get 1 square meter of land space. If the world's population would have kept growing at the rate that it was growing at in the mid-1950s. So, we've got a rapidly slowing population all over the world. Now, there's a number of reasons for this, of course. In rural economies, I grew up on a farm. I was cheap labor. I was real cheap labor. And there was lots of it to be done. But I live in a city today. My kids just cost me money. They don't help. All of us that live in towns know that kids have gone from being an asset to a liability. I'm talking in purely financial terms. Please don't take me seriously. I love my kids very dearly, and I'm a very old dad. So that gives me a whole different perspective too. I got 2 kids, 10 and 11. I tell everybody they ought to be my grandkids, but they're not, they're all mine. And it's really wonderful to be this older dad. But I certainly recognize how much they cost me. Okay, so on to the demographic transition that's going on out there. So what happens? Mortality falls first, and particularly infant mortality. And infant mortality, of course, has come down dramatically all over the world. As infant mortality drops, then the initial effect is that we have a rapidly growing population and a very young population. And of course, this is going to create both costs and benefits. We get what we would refer to as a demographic tailwind. And according to Rob Arnott, one of the best-known finance researchers in North America, that demographic tailwind in North America has added about 1.5% to GDP growth over the last 50 years. We have now switched from a demographic tailwind to a demographic headwind. We are now starting to fly into a much more difficult time. Let me phrase it that way. Okay, so what about fertility? Over the last half century, global average fertility fell from 5 kids per children, down 5 kids per children, 5 kids per female, sorry about that, down to 2.7 children per female. However, we still have a big variance out there. So in the least developed regions of the world, we're still sitting at about 5.2 children per female. But in 19 developed countries around the world, we are now down below 1.3 children per female. How many children per female do we need just to keep a population in steady state?
2.
Yep, slightly over 2.1 is the answer normally given. So we got to have 2.1 children per female just to keep a population at the same level. Here's some each retiree. What's happening to the working age population? The dark green line is what happened. This is a growth rate now over the decade from 1.3. And where do we see the bigger growth here? Of course, in some of the lesser developed countries around the world, here's China down at 1.35. China's probably going to be the first country in the world to get old before it gets rich. This is a huge problem for China that's going to affect all of us. Mortality. So, of course, we've had this falling death rate. And initially we started off with the young, but then we see our lifespan improving. Why? Well, due to better health care throughout our lives, better nutrition, safer working environments. I had a huge eye-opener. I was talking to a doctor who works at a fertility center, and we were talking about third world women in particular, and they told me that 1 out of 7 females in the developing world will die either due to childbirth or childbirth-related complications. It was a number I had no idea of. So as healthcare improves, of course, lifespans get older. Now, so what's happening? Globally, life expectancy at birth has increased from 46.5 years in 1950 to 66 years in 2005. Obviously, again, we still have some of these countries in Africa. I mentioned a couple here. Botswana, Mozambique, Swaziland, where life expectancy today is only 39 years, and this is primarily driven by the HIV problem. Now, what about the number of people that are like me? I'm now 62. So, you know, there was a time I was going to feel really lonely being up here in this advanced age. In 1950, there were 205 million people aged 60 or over in the world. By the year 2000, we had moved that up to about 600 million. By the year 2050, there will be nearly 2 billion people aged 60 or over in the world. 2 billion. Doesn't that just boggle your mind? There's going to be 2 billion people over the age of 60. The 60-plus age cohort is growing way faster than any other age cohort in the world. In fact, by the year 2030, the 60-plus age cohort is going to be growing about 3.5 times as fast as any other age cohort out there. Okay? And we'll talk about the implications of this in a second. Here we're just looking at a few facts. By 2050, 1 out of every 3 people in the world is going to be 60 or older. 1 out of every 3. And in the countries of Austria, the Czech Republic, Greece, Italy, Spain, Slovenia, Spain... Did I put Spain in there twice? It doesn't matter. About 40% of the population is going to be over 60. 40%. Think for a moment about the implications of that. Does that scare you? It should. It scares me. And again, I'll come back to this in a second as to why this scares me. Okay, let's carry on. Just a few more stats and then we'll move into some of the implications. In 1950, there were 24 people 60 and older for each 100 children younger than 15. This was the global average, so I had 24 seniors for every 100 kids. By 2000, Europe had moved to 116 seniors for every 100 kids. By 2050, there will be 263 Europeans for every 100 children. And in Italy and Spain, that is going to be about 400 seniors for each 100 kids under the age of 15. Now, so this old age dependency ratio. What is this that we're talking about here? This is the number of people aged 65 to the number of people of working age. And so it's showing as a number per 100 people of working age. In Europe, it's expected to rise from 22 seniors per 100 workers to 51 seniors per 100 workers. In 2050, Spain's ratio is going to be 74. 74 retirees for each 100 people who are working paying taxes, paying pensions, paying for health care. Japan's is going to be 71. Italy's is going to be 68. This is just a little bit different way of looking at the same data. This is a number of workers for every retiree. Look at Japan. In 1950, there were 10 people working for every one retiree. Today, roughly 2010, we got 2.6. By the year 2050, we're going to be down to 1.2 people working for every one retiree. So, pick who you want it to be. You work, you're retired, I basically split my income. Or more, right? Because that's all those other costs have to be paid. Even Canada, look at where we've come from. 1950, 7.1 workers per retiree. Up to 2050, 2.1 people working per each retiree. What's happening to the working age population? The dark green line is what happened. This is a growth rate now over the decade from 2000 to 2010. So, dark green line, the growth rate from 2000 to 2010. The light green line, the growth rate from 2010 to 2020. As you can see, Japan has had a declining working age population from back prior to 2000. Russia has gone into big decline. Europe is in decline. The United States, look at how the growth rate in the working age population has come down so far. Look at China over there. Okay, I can't quite reach. I need a longer arm. I need an extension on my pointer. That you see how the growth rate in China's working age population has fallen so much. Everybody looks at China and says, here's the answer to the world's problems. Well, I have a real issue with that. I think China might be one of the world's problems very soon, not a solution to the world's problems. And I don't have time to get into all of the reasons why, but there's some very significant things that would lead me to that. Okay, so what are some of these implications? Let's talk about implications for a second. The world is entering, just a couple more quotes here, the world is entering a demographic transformation of unprecedented dimensions. When this revolution has run its course, the impact will have been as powerful as that of any of the great economic and social movements of the past. Here we have just a little bit more data. Looking at the median age, in other words, these countries where half of the population is above this number, half of the population is below it. Taiwan, and this is by 2050, Taiwan, half of the population is expected to be above 56. Japan, 56. Bulgaria, 56. South Korea, Slovenia. All these countries up here are expected to have half of their population older than the age of 50. Okay? And these are countries where the population is either in decline. These were in decline prior to the year 2010. These ones, from the year 2009 to 2029, will be going into an absolute decline in population. And the far column are expected to go into an absolute decline in population between 2030 and 2050. Now, you're all in municipal government, I believe. Is that right? In some way, something connected to it. Can you imagine if instead of saying, how do we manage our growth, it would be, how do we manage our decline? We're expecting our population to go down by so much every year. Values. What's it going to do to GDP? What's it going to do to our ability to tax, to pay pensions, to provide health care? These are really big questions. Hey, see, hey, Canada has nothing to worry about. By the year 2030, Canada's natural population increase would have turned negative. It is only due to immigration that Canada's population will still be growing by the year 2030. Okay? We are not immune from what is going on all over the world. a shrinking world. It's going to affect everything that we do. According to Neil Ferguson, the Harvard economic historian, he says we're about to witness the greatest sustained reduction in European population since the Black Death of the 14th century. The population in some countries is shrinking at 1.5% per year. Over a 35-year period, that's about a 40% reduction in their population. That is staggering. The implications of a country losing 40% of its population are really hard to wrap our minds around. More implications. The coming transformation is both certain and it is lasting. There's almost no chance that it will not happen or that it will be reversed in our lifetimes. Why? Because anybody over the age of 40 in the year 2050 has already been born. Think about that for a moment. Everybody over the age of 40 in the year 2050 is already alive today. We can count them. We know exactly how many there will be. Okay? And because of demographic momentum, population growth takes a long time to slow down, and once you stop it, it takes a long time to speed it back up again. So, what about changes in economic performance? What is this going to do? Now we're moving closer to what we really need to get to. Workforces are going to shrink. We just saw the graph on this. Workforces are going to shrink from one decade to the next in many countries around the world. GDP may stagnate or fall. Everything we're trained to think about is, so what positive rate of growth is our GDP going to be next year? We live in a world where we're trained to think only about how much we can grow. I got news for you. We're going to have to change our mindset. We're going to have to learn how to live in a very different world. As employees become older, they become less adaptable and less mobile. Innovation and entrepreneurship decline. As I look through my area, the world of finance, I'm astounded at how many of these guys made their great breakthroughs when they were 20. Harry Markowitz, the founder of modern portfolio theory, was a 25-year-old doctoral student at the University of Chicago when on a Sunday afternoon he sat down and wrote out the math that underlies modern portfolio theory. He was 25. He is not an anomaly. So as we get older, we tend not to be as innovative. Rates of saving and investment fall. Look at Japan. Japan went from one of the highest saving countries in the world. They were saving about 18% of their personal disposable income 25 years ago. Do you know where they're at today? 2%. They're right down there with us. All driven by demographics. Public sector deficits are probably going to rise. And in fact, that I believe, and I'm just going to tie a link to this in a second, is part of what was going on all over Europe. Europe has been growing very slowly for years. But they didn't want to accept that reality. They want to have everything, just like some of our public sector unions do here. They want it all, but somebody's got to pay for it. You either tax or you borrow. There is no little cookie jar that I can go and pull from. And so, if we don't have growth, then to fund these things, say we either take on debt or we tax people. It's that simple. And current account balances turn negative. A global debt crisis is the result. And this is just obviously one of them. I've spoken at length about the global debt crisis. I'm not going to do a big expose on it here. But I believe that demographics are one little spoken about factor that has led us to what started happening September 15th, 2008, the fall of Lehman Brothers, that has thrown the world into a tailspin where we have not yet dealt with those underlying problems. Between the first quarter of 2004 and the first quarter of 2009, private sector non-financial debt rose by an average of 43% of GDP in the Western countries. It went up by 43% in just a 5-year period. How many of you have come across Reinhardt and Rogoff's wonderful book, This Time is Different, 8 Centuries of Financial Folly? Anybody read it? Put it on your Christmas wish list. You should. They do an extensive review of every financial crisis for the last 800 years. And what precipitates almost all of them? Too much debt. It's real simple. It is too much debt. And what Reinhardt and Rogoff find is that once public debt to GDP gets up into that area of 100%, then it starts to put a real drag on the ability of countries to grow. And they do look at the same thing within consumer debt, corporate debt, debt of all types, because you know what? It's just like you and me. As long as I've got lots of room left on this thing and I can keep running up the credit card, I feel real good. It's when suddenly I get tapped out. I can no longer keep running up the credit card. Now everything goes into reverse. Now I've got to start paying down the credit card. And you know what? How do governments pay down the credit card? It's simple. There's only 4 ways. You cut spending, you increase taxes, you default, or you use inflation. There is no other way. Inflation, I believe, will be back. And I believe that as surely as I believe the sun is coming up in the east tomorrow. It has been used throughout history by governments to get out of overwhelming financial problems. And they are doing everything in their power to bring back inflation. But remember, inflation is just another form of taxation. The problem is it's so insidious that most people don't realize that their wealth is being confiscated. So be very careful. Okay, I'm just going to skip through some of these. One of the things that's happened here with the debt crisis is that we've had this shifting of the debt burden from the private sector to the public sector. We've had a socialization of debt. And what country is that most pronounced in? Of course, that's most pronounced in Japan, where today we're sitting at debt to GDP of about 240%. Just a 2% increase in the cost of debt for Japan will consume roughly 80% of Japan's entire tax revenue. Just a 2% increase. Now, what is Japan trying to do right now? What's Prime Minister Abe trying to do? He said, we're going to create inflation. And what's he targeting? 2%. Now, you guys all kind of know that intuitive relationship. When inflation goes up, what do you all want to happen to the interest rate? You want it to go up. You want compensation, right? This is called the Fisher equation. It comes from Irving Fisher, almost 100 years ago now. We still use it every day. Okay? So, as inflation rises, then the interest rate has to go up as well. If not, you're losing money. And so, if they get their wish with their 2% inflation, unless the central bank in Japan buys up all the debt, if they're going to the market, so will the cost of that debt. And say if it goes up by another 2%, that's consuming 80% of their entire tax revenue. A lot of people today refer to Japan as a bug in search of a windshield. Household debt. Hey, look at where we are. Here's Canada. Right up here, the nice bright red line here, sitting just below Britain in terms of the country with the highest level of household debt to GDP. We certainly are getting up into the nosebleed territory. And this one was on corporate, non-financial corporate sector debt. The big one here was Spain. Companies took out all of this debt, invested in real estate, and then of course the bubble burst. And finally is, what about the financial sector? The poster child here is Britain. Anytime your financial sector gets too big for your country, as it did in Iceland, it has the potential to bring down your entire country. And so we have to be careful. Am I worried? Do I sound worried? That there's obviously two ways forward here. We got an optimistic and a pessimistic outcome. I'm an eternal optimist. My wife tells me I'm a perma-bear. I tell her, no, I'm just realistic. I'm still an eternal optimist, though, about what the future is going to look like. Okay, so what are some of these things that are likely to happen? Older societies, more conservative and risk-averse. Obviously, I look around the room, some of you, like me, were around during the 60s and the 70s. Can you imagine being a parent with teenagers in the 60s and the 70s? Riots across the United States. Students occupying McGill University, throwing the furniture out the windows. Was this something in the water? No, it was called demographics. We had this massive youth bulge that was rising up, and anytime you get that youth bulge, you get huge instability. As we get older, do we see those riots now everywhere in the United States? Remember Haight-Ashbury? They were everywhere. Detroit was on fire. You don't hear that stuff anymore. We're all older. We'd sooner go and have a glass of wine and solve the problems. Okay. What are the other problems here? As we all get older, and I spoke to a grade 12 class here a few months ago, and I was talking about a similar kind of thing, and I said, you know, the bad news is, my generation has really screwed your generation. We ran up the credit card, and now we're going to say to you guys, yeah, sorry about that, but it's your problem. It's not my problem. Because we make up such a large part of the voting block, then we are able to lock in what is important to us and say, yeah, screw you guys. You're young. You figure it out. This is one of the big problems that we've got. Smaller families may make the public less willing to risk scarce youth in war. That we are much less prone to go to war because we don't want to risk those scarce children. Immigration, higher minority fertility may undermine civic cohesion. You're seeing this all across Europe right now. Look at what's driving the latest elections to Brussels. So many of them have been driven by this movement to the far right, where they are saying, enough of the immigration is too fast, that is changing the nature and complexion of our countries at a rate that we cannot absorb. Changes in social mood. In some countries, this transition is going to be so extreme, such as in Russia, lose a third of its population by 2050, or is rising so rapidly as in China, and I mentioned this before, probably the only country in history that's going to get old before it gets rich, that we have to be very careful of economic or political crises erupting. What about our influence as the developed world? Going back to 1930, the developed world made up 25% of global population. By 2050, we will make up less than 10% of global population. So, what do you think about our influence? Are we still going to be the big bully in the schoolyard, throwing our weight around? Unfortunately, we're losing much of that ability to do that. We are just becoming which is, don't get me wrong, that's probably a good thing. And I speak here more on behalf of the United States than Canada. Canada never has done that. But our global influence is going to become much smaller. And some of that we see right now, where China is saying, you know what? The South China Sea belongs to us. Thank you very much. 10 years ago, nobody ever thought that that could become a flashpoint. Today, that is no longer the thought out there. What are some more of these geopolitical implications? Most nations in sub-Saharan Africa, some nations in the Muslim world, are going to have this large youth bulge for right through into the 1930s. Think back to North America, 1960s. Okay? Arab Spring. Did this stuff just kind of come out of nowhere? Of course not. This is being driven by these forces that we often don't think about. I was traveling to Saudi Arabia several times a year for 4 years working with the central bank. And I look over there and I see the youth unemployment. 50% of their youth aren't employed. When you've got unemployed youth with money, does that sound like a recipe for disaster? No wonder the king is scared. And how does he deal with it so far? He digs deeper into his pocket and doles out more cash. Now, money is the opiate that is being used to try to keep the population quiet. It probably won't last forever, as it hasn't lasted in so many of these other countries throughout the Middle East and North Africa. The 2020s, this is a period of maximum danger. Global aging is going to hit hardest. Workforce is stagnant or falling. The ratio of seniors to workers is rising rapidly. Big youth bulges in many Muslim and Latin American countries. And Russia and Eastern Europe are entering into their decade of fastest workforce decline. So, we haven't yet got into that period when we are at maximum danger. So, there's a bunch of things. That's the pessimistic side. Where's the optimistic side? Well, in order to increase output, a country needs just two things. It needs one or the other. Either a growing population or the productivity of its existing population has got to grow. There's no other way. If you want GDP to grow, you either need more people or every person has got to produce more output. That's it. So, is this going to happen? Well, we know that growth is slowing all over the country, all over the world. And say we are going to be increasingly trying to attract good immigrants to come here. We're not the only game in town. We probably think we are. We're not. And those other countries are going to be doing more and more to try to attract those best immigrants to their countries. So, technology. I'm a huge believer in technology. Moore's Law. Computing power doubles every, what was that?
2 years.
2 years. It still seems to be operating, doesn't it? Okay? And we see this exponential growth in so many forms of technology. Things that we can't even envision today. I still remember the fax machine and thinking, what an awesome innovation. It wasn't that long ago. Does anybody ever even have a fax machine anymore? Okay? We can't even imagine where technology is going to lead us. But we got to figure out how to marshal it for our benefit and not to our detriment. And of course, the other one is healthcare. For years, I kept telling people, forget this Freedom 55. This is a figment of the imagination of the insurance and the mutual fund industry. Start thinking Freedom 70. And of course, that's still true, especially in worlds where we can only get 1% interest on our savings. But with better health care, we are going to live much longer, but also much healthier lives. We're going to be vigorous. We're going to be out there doing what we want to do, being productive. And so when we talk about these support ratios, you know, we're still looking at this from an age when you turn 60 and you were ready to crawl into your rocking chair and bid the world adios. That's not the way it is anymore. I can't imagine what retirement looks like. I'm 62. I'm hoping that that day is in some far distant year, which I can't yet imagine. Okay, so this is just a little graph showing us what has happened with global labor productivity. And the unfortunate thing we see here was a real leveling out in the last little bit. Are we going to see some more of these big jumps? I expect that we will. I don't have a good crystal ball to tell you where they're going to come from. But I'm an optimist and I think they will be there. Okay, let me just bring this thing to an end. Demographic change is inevitable. It is happening whether we like it or not. The impact is going to vary from country to country. We have to understand it. We have to figure out how to work with it and not try to work against it or ignore it. The winners are going to be those who embrace this and figure out how to profit by it. Thank you very much. It's been fun to have a chat.
We have some time for questions. Are there any questions from the audience? Yes, Kathy.
You talked a little bit about productivity, and that's one thing that I think a lot of us are struggling with. We hear from our employers that the youth of today have no work ethic, that they're all lazy, they don't really want to work. And when you look at your projections for much of the baby boomers retiring, how much is productivity going to affect how our economy moves forward, given the baby boomers are leaving and the youth have no work ethic? According to reports,
Sure. I'm not sure how, but we will figure out how to leverage technology to improve productivity. As I mentioned, I've got two kids, 10 and 11, and I am blown away by their ability to take this technology and to use it in creative ways that I never would have thought of. So, and I agree, I spoke at a grade 12 class on Monday, and as I knew walking in that I was walking into a hornet's nest. It was, if this was typical of grade 12s, graduating, I'd say we're a deep doo-doo. But it's not. I see so many of these young people, and what I hear is what you're saying. I hear this. I see hundreds of students coming through my classes, and these are bright students. They work incredibly hard. They are way ahead of where I was. I stand in awe of so many of my students because they are so accomplished at such a young age. And so, again, I'm an eternal optimist based on what I see walking through the doors of my classroom.
Any other questions?
Yes.
Talking about the demographics, you didn't touch on the impact on rural communities, and you know, there are naysayers out there who say that you know, rural communities are doomed to be extinguished, and I tend not to believe that. But how do you see the demographics? How do you see us countering that?
Sure. What I see, and I grew up on a farm. I love that farm, that rural life. And one of the things I think we have to look at is how do we figure out, first of all, the benefits of being there, lower cost of living, less stress, and then we create places for all of these people who are fed up with the stress, the crime, that don't know your neighbor that happens when you live in big urban areas, and say, you know what, we got something way better. Come to our community and retire here. I think there's a huge opportunity to pull so many of these aging baby boomers out of here and out into these smaller communities. I spoke in Kimberley at a real estate symposium 2 weeks ago, and that's exactly what Kimberley is trying to do. Is saying, anybody from Kimberley here? No? Cranbrook? Okay. So I think there's a huge opportunity to do that, to say, come here. We can offer you so much more. Your dollars will go so much further. Absolutely don't believe it when people tell you your communities are doomed to die. They absolutely aren't.
So just to follow up on that, and I'm from the island, so
Okay.
you know, the retirement angle's been done. Now, you know, what we need is the 25 to 40 demographic, that one that keeps our communities towards the future.
Absolutely.
If you're looking 30 years ahead, the
Sure.
retirees won't solve your problem. So do you have any insight on that?
My sense is that if we bring in a number of retirees with big bank accounts, somebody is going to want to be there to sell those people all of the services that they are going to want. They're used to a relatively affluent lifestyle. They want to have nice restaurants. They want to drive nice cars. They want to take nice holidays. They want to have homes smaller but furnished very tastefully. I see a whole industry that grows out of this, led by the influx of the wealthier senior and all the people who will then, and it's only obviously one element of what you need for a healthy community, but I see it as one element. Anybody else?
Okay.
All right. Thank you very much, everybody.